My two college friends, Mike and Lucas, and I had planned a weekend camping trip deep in the woods near our town. We weren't exactly the outdoorsy type, except for Lucas, who had spent his childhood exploring forests and rivers. So, it was Lucas who took charge of the trip, guiding us to a spot he knew well, a secluded area by the river, hidden a couple of miles into the woods. The hike there was peaceful, with the occasional chirping of birds and rustling leaves, setting the perfect tone for our weekend getaway. When we finally reached the clearing, the sight was breathtaking. A vast open field stretched out before us, bordered by the dense forest on one side and the flowing river on the other. We decided to set up our camp right in the middle, where we had a clear view of both the woods and the water. As we pitched our tents and got everything in place, I couldn't help but feel a sense of tranquility that you can only find in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. After everything was set, we cracked open a few beers and gathered around the campfire, chatting and laughing as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warmth of the fire and the sound of the river flowing nearby were soothing, and for a moment I felt completely at ease. But then something caught my eye, movement near the tree line. I squinted, trying to get a better look. There were a few figures moving slowly, almost blending in with the trees. They were dressed in what looked like dirty, camouflage-style clothes and had backpacks slung over their shoulders. But what struck me as odd was that I didn't see any rifles, which you'd expect from hunters. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked, pointing them out to Mike and Lucas. Mike glanced over, shrugging it off, but Lucas furrowed his brow. "That's strange," he muttered. "Hunting isn't allowed in these woods, and besides, it's not even hunting season." There was a hint of concern in his voice that put me on edge. Mike, always the joker, laughed it off, saying Lucas was just being paranoid. We tried to go back to our conversation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hours passed, and eventually, we decided it was time to turn in for the night. The hike and the beer had worn us out, and we figured a good night's sleep would recharge us for the next day's adventure. But as I lay in my tent, sleep wouldn't come. There was something unsettling about being out in the open, with only a thin layer of fabric between me and the dark, endless woods. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the silence of the night. I must have been tossing and turning for a couple of hours when suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. My heart started to race as I strained to listen. At first, I thought it was Mike or Lucas, maybe coming back from the bathroom. But the steps were too soft, too numerous, to be just one of them. And they were getting closer. I held my breath, my ears finely tuned to every sound. There were definitely multiple sets of footsteps, maybe 3 or more, all moving in a line toward our tents. But the most unnerving part was that there were no lights, no flashlights, no headlamps, nothing. Whoever it was, they were moving through the darkness without any light to guide them. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that they would just pass by and leave us alone. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just feet away from our tents. I could hear the soft crunch of grass underfoot, the almost rhythmic sound of their movement. My mind raced with possibilities. Who were they, and what were they doing out here in the middle of the night? After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally started to fade. I slowly unzipped my tent, careful not to make a sound, and peeked outside. At that exact moment, Mike did the same, and our eyes met, both of us wide-eyed and terrified. We looked toward the tree line, and there they were, silhouettes moving away from us, barely visible in the dim light. I slipped out of my tent and hurried over to Lucas, shaking him awake. "Lucas, wake up. Something's wrong." As Mike and I recounted what we had just witnessed, I saw the color drain from Lucas's face. For a guy who had spent so much time in the woods, he looked genuinely scared, and that scared me even more. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice trembling. Without hesitation, we started packing up our gear as fast as we could, the eerie silence of the night pressing down on us. Suddenly, Lucas froze, his eyes locked on something in the distance. "Hurry up," he whispered urgently. Mike and I followed his gaze, And there they were again. The same group of figures, now standing at the edge of the woods, just staring at us. My blood ran cold. There were more of them now, 5 or 6 at least, all just standing there watching us. Adrenaline surged through me as I shoved everything into my backpack. "Let's go," I hissed, and we all bolted for the trail, leaving our campfire and any leftover gear behind. We didn't dare turn on our flashlights, instead relying on the faint moonlight to guide us as we stumbled through the woods, our hearts pounding in our chests. The journey back was a blur of fear and darkness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, half expecting those figures to appear out of the shadows. But somehow we made it back to the trailhead, exhausted and shaken, but safe. To this day, I have no idea who those people were or what they were doing out there in the middle of the night. But one thing's for sure. Our encounter with them was no accident, and it's an experience that will haunt me for a long time. It was a cool, quiet night in 2016, and for some reason I felt an urge to go for a run. It was around 11 p.m., not exactly the usual time for a jog, but I've always been a bit different. I prefer the solitude of the night, the peace that comes with knowing no one else is around. The suburban neighborhood I live in is one of the safest in the state, so I never felt uneasy about being out late. Even with the recent discovery of a dead body in the nature preserve near my house, I didn't think twice about heading there for my run. The preserve is vast, with miles of biking and hiking trails winding through dense patches of trees. During the day, it's a haven for families and nature lovers, but at night it transforms into something entirely different. I held my phone tightly, using its flashlight to guide me as I entered the trail. The only sounds were the crunch of dirt under my sneakers and the distant rustle of leaves. It was completely dark, the kind of darkness that makes you hyper-aware of every noise, every shadow. I started my run, feeling strangely energized by the cool night air. There was something exhilarating about the stillness, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just the beam of my flashlight and the path in front of me. After about 10 minutes, I started to tire. I wasn't exactly in the best shape back then, and I needed a break. I found a bench on the side of the trail and sat down, trying to catch my breath. As I sat there, the reality of being alone in the pitch-black preserve began to settle in. It felt eerily similar to being in the middle of a forest, miles from civilization. The occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig put me on edge. I knew most of the sounds were just animals, a raccoon, maybe a fox, but that didn't stop the creeping fear from building inside me. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of leaves crunching underfoot close by. My heart rate spiked as I scanned the area with my phone's flashlight. The beam wasn't strong enough to cut through the darkness, but I could just make out the silhouette of something tall, partially hidden behind a tree. At first I thought it might be another runner or maybe someone out for a late-night walk, but the situation felt off. Way off. I stood up, moving cautiously toward the figure. My legs felt like jelly, but curiosity, or maybe fear, propelled me forward. I crouched slightly, trying to stay low as if that would somehow make me invisible. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Wrapped around the tree was a hand covered in what looked like an old, dirty white glove. I felt a chill run down my spine, my instincts screaming at me to turn and run, but I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from that gloved hand. Then, slowly, the figure stepped out from behind the tree and into the beam of my flashlight. It was a clown. Not just any clown, though. This was during the 2016 clown epidemic, when reports of creepy clowns terrorizing people were all over the news. This person had gone all out with the costume. Smeared makeup, a garish wig, oversized shoes. But the most terrifying part was the weapon he held, a wooden bat with a massive rusted spike driven through it. The clown stood there, head tilted downward in a way that made the entire scene even more nightmarish. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, then another, each one heavier and more menacing than the last. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I was already exhausted from the run, but there was no other choice. I had to get out of there. I turned and bolted into the woods, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't care that I was running off the trail into the unknown. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance between myself and that clown as possible. The branches and bushes tore at my clothes and skin, but I kept going until I felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, and I knew I couldn't keep running. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind a tree, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear the clown's footsteps crashing through the woods, drawing closer and closer. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. The footsteps passed by, no more than 10 feet from where I was hiding, and then continued on into the darkness. I waited, not daring to move until the sound of his pursuit faded completely. When I finally felt it was safe, I scrambled back to the trail and ran as fast as I could back to the entrance of the preserve. My legs were trembling and my vision was blurry, but I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the streetlights. By then, I was so exhausted that I actually vomited on the sidewalk, the terror and exertion finally catching up with me. Looking back, I should have been more cautious, especially with the recent discovery of that dead body in the preserve. Everyone suspected it was connected to the clown sightings, but nothing was ever confirmed. All I know is that I stayed far away from the preserve after that night and never, ever ventured in after dark again. I've always enjoyed the peace and solitude that comes with camping alone, so when I found myself with a free weekend, I decided to pack up and head out to the woods just a few miles from my house. It wasn't far, but it was remote enough that I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. I arrived early in the afternoon, set up my tent, and had a quick meal. The tranquility of the forest was exactly what I needed, and after everything was in place, I decided to take a nap in my tent. The nap was brief, about 30 minutes or so, but it was enough to recharge me for a hike. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so, with just the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I began to notice something odd, a sound that didn't quite belong. Footsteps. They were faint but distinct, and what struck me most was how they sounded almost human. I stopped and listened for a moment, but the forest seemed to hold its breath. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there, watching. The nearest town was miles away, and it was unlikely that anyone else would be this deep into the woods. Still, I pushed the thought aside and continued my hike, refusing to let paranoia ruin my day. When I finally returned to my campsite, the first thing I noticed was that something was off. The zipper of my tent was undone and the door flap was open. My heart began to race as I realized that someone had been inside my tent. I quickly checked to make sure no one was still there, then examined my belongings. My bag had been rummaged through, but strangely nothing was taken. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself that whoever it was had left and wouldn't be coming back. I considered packing up and moving to a different spot, but in the end I decided to stay put. It was getting late, and I didn't want to wander around in the dark. As night fell, I crawled into my tent and settled into my sleeping bag, hoping to shake off the unease that had been with me since the hike. But sleep didn't come easily. A few minutes after I lay down, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a strange, staticky sound that didn't belong in the quiet of the forest. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, maybe just the wind or some electronic interference. But no sooner had I closed my eyes again than the noise returned, this time louder, clearer. It was a grainy, staticky breathing sound, like someone was right there with me. I fumbled through my bag, my hands shaking, until I found the source of the noise. It was a large, archaic-looking walkie-talkie, something I was sure I hadn't packed. My blood ran cold as I realized that whoever had been in my tent had left it there. Before I could process what was happening, the static on the walkie-talkie stopped. replaced by the sound of slow, deliberate breathing. Then, in a deep, distorted whisper, I heard words that sent a chill down my spine. "I'm not your cat." It's hard to describe the sheer terror that gripped me in that moment. It felt like my whole world had tilted, and all I could think about was getting out of there alive. I desperately pressed buttons on the walkie-talkie trying to turn it off, but my hands were shaking so badly that it took me several attempts. When the static finally stopped, I heard something heavy hit the ground outside my tent. I froze, my mind racing with fear. I had a choice to make: stay and protect my belongings, or run for my life. The decision was made for me when I heard another thud, closer this time, right outside my tent. I grabbed what little I could and bolted from the tent, running as fast as my legs could carry me toward my pickup truck. The night air was cold and biting, but I didn't stop until I was behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the campsite. I left everything behind: my tent, my sleeping bag, all my gear. But none of it mattered. All I cared about was getting as far away from that place as possible. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what their intentions were. Maybe it was just someone playing a sick joke, or maybe it was something far more sinister. But one thing is certain: I've never gone camping alone since that night, and I don't plan to ever again.